Today, I have for you Dr. Damon Cudihy, OBGYN, to talk about what I call the sum of all reproductive heresies, IVF. Dr. Damon, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Glad to be here.
You really impressed me with I don't know, I don't want to call it a talking point, but a kind of synopsis on IVF as the synthesis of all of the reproductive sins rolled into one. If anything, it's not less, it's more than all of them because it's a combination of all these sins.
I'm going to come back to the list because I think going back to origins is important as well. And when I am digging into this, it's really shocking what we learn about the beginnings of IVF and who actually invented it and why it was invented in the process. And so we go back to this zoologist named Robert Edwards in England, who later received the Nobel laureate for developing this. He had a partner who was an abortionist, actually, a guy named Patrick Steptoe. So he was funding his IVF research in the early 70s by doing abortions, sometimes late-term abortions on the side. You know, interestingly and relatedly, he was also an innovator in new types of sterilization using the laparoscope. So a lot of laparoscopic procedures today to sterilize women were invented by, and perfected, in a sense, by this co-inventor of the IVF procedure. So, again, this shouldn't surprise us, that you have that kind of moral, hardened, that kind of moral compromised person involved in this. And there's a connection to even a mockery of the Catholic faith too. And there was a quote, and I think it was a New York Times interview not that long ago by the Robert Edwards, where he says, and I'll quote here, "I wanted to find out exactly who was in charge, whether it was God himself or whether it was scientists in the laboratory. It was us," he says. "The Pope looked totally stupid."
Wow.
Yeah, you can never ban anything. This is still quoting this, the IVF inventor. You can quote, you can say, "Hang on a minute," but never say never, and never say that this is the worst decision for mankind. Otherwise, you can look a fool. And listen to this last part of the quote. "Now there are as many Roman Catholics coming for treatment as Protestants." So he's mocking us. He's mocking the Catholic Church that, among the women and couples that are coming to him for IVF, that there's no distinction between Catholics and Protestants. I think we see that, and other things like sterilization and even abortion, where this has been going on. But so the beginning of IVF, the first child that survived the process was named Louis Brown and born in 1978. And then, the church, pretty soon after, and John and Vitae, by then, Cardinal Ratzinger of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, put out this document clarifying, why this was, unacceptable. So just with that background, we're starting to get back to this list. So we talked about exploitation of young women, sterilization. Now, I don't know if it's always done, but I would say it's frequently done in the process. And so how is the sperm obtained? And it theoretically could be obtained in a more illicit manner, but it's not. I've never heard of an IVF procedure done and in one of these potentially morally illicit means of procurement. The way it's normally done.
Sure. Technically speaking, it could be procured without getting into the logistics too much. Technically speaking, it could be procured without, I guess, pornography.
Right.
Given the imaginative powers of the agent.
But
I mean, it couldn't be procured fully illicitly, right? Because it's got to be.
Well, I mean, so going back to Dr. Hilger's, there's theologians that looked at this using a perforated condom type device. So in a normal act of intercourse, that it's not purely contraceptive, with even some perforations, some of the sperm could get through the latex barrier, and you could still collect the majority of the sperm within the normal marital act. So that's how it could be theoretically procured. And so that's how pro-life Catholic physicians like myself, if we do find a need to obtain performance semen analysis, that's how it would be collected. So it would be done in a way that's not degrading to the husband or the marriage, or the marital act. So but people that are going to that extreme, are not involved in IVF. So masturbation is the ordinary and almost the exclusive means of collection. And then pornography is typically distributed as one IVF technicians, that, as they call them, aids, to help men, if they, don't have enough imagination. So it's a normal part of the process. And then the next thing I put on there that I alluded to before is material adultery. So when your wife is getting pregnant from the sperm of another man, it may not be physical full adultery, but if his sperm is put into her body through artificial insemination, which is a spinoff of this issue, but even in a petri dish and she's bearing another child, there's a certain sense in which that would be a material adultery, or it could be the other way around with another woman's egg. And so that's, again, a part of third-party reproduction. But this is an important one. Number 7 on my list is a commodification of children. Now children have become products to be manufactured, purchased, and in a sense kind of sold. I'll never forget, we were taking a family road trip when I was finishing my residency training up north. We were driving down 75 to my wife's family. And I saw this, what at first glance was a beautiful picture of a child on a billboard. It looked like one of these Choose Life pictures with a newborn baby smiling, but this was very different. This billboard, it had a message across it that said, "Want one," with a question mark. It was an advertisement for an IVF clinic. And that just really kind of just solidified in my mind what was going on here. We're selling babies as a commodity now. And young, children that grow up in a family, oftentimes a single, a single child, maybe 2, or if they had twins, they experience that. And there's a whole movement of these children. And there's a website called thembeforeus.com, I believe it is. They profile a lot of these stories of just the psychological suffering and existential suffering, knowing that they have siblings that, never made it, that they don't know about. So again, so number 7, the commodification of children. Number 8, the financial exploitation of women and men. People aren't aware of how expensive this is. It typically takes more than 2 cycles. So on average, about 3 cycles. Each cycle is going to be about $20,000 or more. A lot of that's for the medications. You have a lot of couples that both parents are working. They take out a second mortgage on their house, literally spend all their life savings, go into debt, $100,000 many times by the time they actually get pregnant with a child that's going to make it to viability to live outside the womb. So there's that aspect of it. And I said financial exploitation is also an emotional and a spiritual exploitation of women. Most people don't intuitively want to go through this sort of bypassing of the natural act of intercourse. They're desperate. They're suffering for the deprivation of a good, which is fertility. And so they're emotionally vulnerable. And so you have this industry that's exploiting them. And it's not too far off from the way that a typical abortion clinic exploits the suffering or the fear of women unexpectedly pregnant, in a situation where they don't feel they're prepared to raise a child. Which goes into the next thing. So item number 9, pre-implantation diagnosis. So this is a type of eugenic selection, where you now have all the embryos in the petri dish, and you've already gone through this process of grading, where they've looked under the microscope and they've assigned them a grade like they do eggs or meat. It's typically a letter, or rather a number, and then 2 letters. You might have like 3 BC, something like that. And the ones that are graded in terms of quality by the way they look under the microscope are typically discarded, literally thrown in the trash. That's their language. They throw these human beings in the trash if they're deemed to be of inferior quality. They think they may not survive the process.
So
but the ones that
let me stop you there. We're talking about fertilized eggs now.
We're talking about human beings. Yeah,
human
absolutely.
beings. We're talking about human beings qua fertilized eggs. A lot of folks out there, even knowledgeable Catholics, do not understand what you just said. So I just want to, measure what we're saying here. That basically every IVF act involves abortion. Have there been IVF acts that don't involve the throwing out of fertilized eggs qua human beings?
I'm not aware of any. It's theoretically possible, but I doubt that it happens with any regularity, because as we spoke briefly about on the phone, it wouldn't be financially, profitable for them to only fertilize 1 or 2 eggs, because there'd be such a low rate of success. And so these clinics advertise their success rate. So they want to do everything they can to maximize their success and a pure, outcomes measure. And I'm glad you brought that up, Tim, because this is another thing where we need to be clear, on a lot of the leftist, secular media, we'll hear things, and probably will continue to hear things like, Catholics, have this religious belief that life begins at conception. And when I speak about this, I try to make the point that we don't believe that life begins at conception, which we now need to clarify is synonymous with fertilization. I'll get into that later. We don't believe that because the church teaches it. We believe that because that is the scientific, biologic consensus of our understanding of the origin of human life. And this was
the church teaches it, in other words, because of the science. The church does not teach this as a doctrine of the faith. It teaches it as an article of natural biology and human life.
I would go further. I would say the church merely teaches that it's always and everywhere a universal truth, an absolute truth. It's always and everywhere immoral and illicit, unacceptable, intrinsic evil to intentionally kill an innocent human being. So when those three criteria are met, when it's intentional, when the human person is innocent, and when it's a human person. And so all we are doing is applying our intelligence, our understanding of the science here, now that we know, and there's no dispute about the fact that this is a human being, that we are dealing now with a unique individual human person, a full complement of chromosomes. This is not the woman's body. This is not my body. It came together as a contribution from both of our bodies, but now we are scientifically speaking about a new person. This happens at the one cell stage. And so, yeah, I've had patients that, were Catholic that seem to be a little bit confused about that because, like abortion, we want to kind of obfuscate the reality of what's going on. So women will be talked about as if these are just eggs, or they're just fertilized eggs with kind of an emphasis on the egg, that we're not talking about embryos, and these are inferior quality eggs. And even though we're actually, the scientific honest, analysis is that these are not just eggs anymore. These are actually human beings now. Another, kind of pro-life point, in discussing this, you or I were never a sperm cell or an egg cell, but once, our parents, the union of the egg and the sperm, that's when our life began. And so this idea that, when that sperm dying is equivalent to abortion is preposterous, we've heard in, some of these pro-abortion talking points. But there's an
analogy to be made here to help people flesh this out.
Yeah.
It is actually, according to Pius X, a condemnable heresy to allege that the belief in one God is an article of the faith. Did you know that? It's not. The belief in a single God is a proposition of natural reason, and it's undeniable through the natural reason. Similarly, it hasn't been anathematized as a heresy, but similarly, this belief that you just pointed up, Dr. Damon, the belief that, abortion is wrong, abortion is murder, abortion stops a beating human heart, has anything to do with religious doctrine, which is to say teaching, is like unto a heresy, right? It's simply 46 chromosomes that are human. A small fertilized egg is human life. It's living and it's human. It's living and it's human. It is human life. It is a human being. This is a simple proposition of science, and the church teaches what it teaches about abortion simply because of this. This is not one of the articles of the faith like the hypostatic union or the doctrine of the
transubstantiation. Yeah, absolutely. Right. It should be evident. And this reminds me, I want to throw a shout out to the journalist John Zmirak. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He published an article recently in the stream, and I quoted it, and I put it on Twitter and some of my friends. He said, in an interview I heard with him yesterday with Jason Jones, he says that the evil of abortion is more certain than the existence of God. And that blows my mind. I mean, we don't want to believe that's true, but in the conversion story of Steve Mosher, for those of you who are familiar with his work with Population Research Institute, he discovered the one-child policy in China. He was an atheist at the time, but the horror of the forced abortion, the forced sterilization of these women in China, actually eventually led him to God and seeing the evil of that. And when he came back to the United States. So you're right. This isn't an article of faith. And that's why we have many atheists and people of different faiths that can see this. It's not, you don't have to be Catholic to appreciate this, although it makes it a lot easier to, understand the principles involved when we get into double effect, things like that, and how that's a distinct matter. So
yeah, I'm friends with Zmirak. That I can't, you can't get more certain than certain. And that would explode the analogy if true. And it was actually it would be like a Pyrrhic victory if that were fully true, that the evils of abortion might equal the certainty, epistemically speaking, of the certainty of the existence of God. But of course,
Right.
if God weren't as a matter of plain brute fact existent, then abortion wouldn't be evil. So I'd have to demur, but it's at least as it's
Sure.
as certain.
And I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but it's very thought provoking, and I can relate in my own deepening conversion as a college student. When I entered college, I had a much deeper conviction that abortion, that child murder is evil than I did that the Catholic faith was the true faith. And it was actually, I was drawn in deeper into the faith because of an awareness of how clear this was. And I saw the church as being the most consistent witness, for these truths. So there was a connection, but yeah, I see your point there.